you very much indeed, Paul. It's a real privilege to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me. And I feel quite humbled, really, to be here because I know the strength of your traditions around history teaching. And I did say to Paul when he invited me, you know, what have I got, really, that I can share? And he said some very nice things about some of the things that we had perhaps discovered and were beginning to question and think about in England after a very long tradition of developing history education in a critical way. And I said, well, I'll come out, but only to share our mistakes. So, and I say that in all seriousness, because we do have a long tradition in England in particular. My remarks do relate to England, Scotland, England, Wales, and Northern Ireland do things slightly differently. There's a lot of similarity, but for the avoidance of confusion and doubt, I'm largely going to relate to what's taken place in history teaching in England. But what is very interesting is that precisely because we have been thinking about history as a critical practice, as a democratizing process, as a very rich way of introducing children to a varied source record, all the things that I know you hold dear here as well. Precisely because we've been doing that for a very long time, we have also begun together to learn from our mistakes, that a huge amount can go wrong with those practices, which is not to say that those practices are wrong, but rather that it is very, very challenging to make them work well, particularly to make them work well for the full range of attainment. As Paul stressed, my background is in teaching history in state schools, all ability state schools. So my experience is with teaching the full attainment range. And I suppose throughout my career as a teacher, as a leader of history teachers, and as a teacher trainer, I have specialized in teaching low attainers and what I would call marginalized, often multiply marginalized children, whether they're marginalized perhaps because of ethnicity or because of a lack of understanding of cultural context, because of hitherto low attainment, whatever the cause. It's the marginalized children that we need to think about most, I think, in history, because if we're excluding them, then history is not doing its job. But it's precisely those children that throughout my career, starting just as an ordinary history teacher and carrying on from that and working with thousands of other history teachers, it's those children I end up worrying about the most. And sometimes I feel we have been slow in England, and maybe this is true internationally as well, to ask really hard questions about whether we're actually helping those children as well as we might. Even though our goals, I think, are incontrovertibly the right ones, that we want children to be critical and we want them to be creative, we want them to take their place as citizens of a country and of a world, to contribute, to build varied identities, to respect the identities of others, and so on and so forth. These broad, expansive aims of history education, around which there's considerable consensus. When it actually comes to those children who struggle with history, sometimes I think we need to be a little more complex in our understanding of how they might get there. So what I'm going to do is just share some stories of our mistakes, and a little bit too around the journey that history teachers, and I really stress history teachers here more than history education academics, even though I was one, the journeys that history teachers have been on in solving some of those problems. So I want to give what I hope is an honest, perhaps provocative account of some of the things that go wrong when we implement a critical tradition, but also to share some of the ways in which we in England began to solve some of those problems and the process of solving them. And as I do that, I know that both the problems and the solutions will resonate with you, because I'm well aware and have studied carefully your traditions and challenges at the moment. So, for example, to give you a flavour of what's to come, some of the challenges that come from examinations, which purport to test source skills, I can see nods around the room immediately, but actually kill off meaningful work with sources and put off children, and at worst, profoundly distort the subject. Right, I'm sure that's something that many of you have experienced. And whilst examiners and teachers the world over are trying to fix that problem, I do think there are some recurring patterns from which we can learn in the problems and in the solutions. So this is very much an overview of a range of issues. Tomorrow I'm going to be working again with, I think, probably largely the same group of people. And tomorrow I'm going to drill down in my workshop into much more detail, and we're going to look at some practicalities, particularly around my favourite subject, which is the issue of knowledge in history education and how we need to use it and ways of reconstructing it. But that's for tomorrow. Today, I'm going to give an overview of issues, and I hope provoke. And we may have a little bit of time, I hope, for some questions at the end. But if not, we can always chat over the break. So, evaluating the legacy of the 1970s/80s revolution in history education, lessons from England. So, just want to take you back to where, for us, it all began. And of course, this was a development that was very influential internationally. It did have some comparable origins elsewhere in the world, but in the main, other jurisdictions in the world tended to take what we had done here in the 1970s and to copy it. And often I see things that we've done in England being picked up 20, sometimes 30 years later in other countries. And I think, help, you've taken the original that we did, but you haven't learned from the mess we made of it in those 20, and you're going to make the same mistakes that we made. Why are you doing that? So I want to go right back and just think through some of the things that we learned from a thoroughly good and well-intentioned project, which I'm very, very glad happened. It solved enormous problems, but which needs a lot of thought if it's going to be done well. So where it all began was something called, for us in England, the Schools Council History Project in 1972. At the time, there was a government agency called the Schools Council, which had all kinds of projects, many of them in the humanities and history. But this particular project survived. And this particular project went on to be hugely influential, actually throughout the UK and beyond. And it probably went on to be hugely influential because it was very, very well theorized. And because it quickly developed an organized movement of teachers actually developing the materials. So it became very widespread and put down very strong roots. But the reason it also really took off was because it developed an exam. And if you develop an exam, then stuff starts to be embedded. And at the time, we had a sort of split 16+ examination systems of O-levels for the more able students and CSEs for the rest. And quite quickly, this particular option took over a third of exam choices in schools. So a third of children doing history found themselves doing the SCHP option, or later it was known as SHP when it changed its name in 1983. So why did this project come about? What problem was it trying to solve? Well, I've summarized it rather crudely there, a decline in history education in all but the private, independent and selective schools, and perhaps the high-achieving comprehensive schools. There, nobody would have thought history was in decline. But what started to surface in government inspector reports around this time was a realization that history was disappearing in our state schools for the majority of children, particularly for lower retainers. And what began to surface in these alarming reports in the late 1960s by Her Majesty's Inspectorate was a sense that a lot of schools were finding that history, as it was then taught, was simply not achievable, was not palatable for the vast majority of children. Now, it might have been the type of history that was being taught, which tended to be high politics, international history, British and European history of a very traditional kind. It might have been the way it was taught, but for whatever reason, many teachers were feeling that children simply could not access history. And so history as a discipline was disappearing into integrated humanities, civics, citizenship, even something called social studies, which was starting to appear. And so history is a distinctive way of knowing. And history is a body of content that one needed to move about within your own knowledge and make sense of the past was rapidly disappearing for the majority of children. And this was coming to the notice of the educated classes of the government very, very late, largely because often the masses are hidden, are they not? And so, you know, the children of the chattering classes probably weren't experiencing this. They might have been in private or independent or selective schools or high-achieving comprehensives. But for the vast majority, they were leaving school actually with minimal knowledge of history. And very well-intentioned, interesting things were being done, sometimes quite good things done in the names of things like integrated humanities. But the inspectors noted an awful lot of children were surfacing with, at best, a very incoherent grasp of history. So the solution that teachers were putting in place, which was something that was deemed friendlier, more practical, more relevant, more blended subjects, actually wasn't achieving its goals. It might have gathered some temporary interest, but it wasn't leaving children with knowledge of the past. A famous article by Mary Price in 1969 shook the establishment to the core. History in Danger, she wrote as her title, and argued that we were about to see history as a subject disappearing from our school curricula. 1969, very interesting. So, the Schools Council History Project, and I'm oversimplifying here, it was not the only thing that gave them all sorts of movements in different quarters and various people arguing for change. But the Schools Council History Project codified some new ideas and put them to the test and evaluated them in a very systematic way because it had considerable government funding. And the two watchwords behind the project were the two R's. Relevant and rational were the words. Relevant, to deal with this problem of young people perhaps not perceiving the value and relevance of history education. But rational was extremely important to the project's architects, because what they meant by rational was, let's try to understand what historical knowledge is. Let's try to understand how it is constructed. Let's try to understand what is distinctive about the discipline of history. How is it different from geography or science or English? Let's understand the conditions under which valid claims about the past can be made. And what do we want children to know about that? So children understanding it as a critical practice that would empower them and that would be a democratizing experience. So relevant and rational were the watchwords of this project. And the features of that project, I've again crudely summarized underneath. It started to produce the kind of content that was much more responsive to the way in which history was actually changing in universities and had been for some time. So things like Black history, things like the history of migration, things like women's history, world history, different conceptions of ways of organizing and choosing content. Things like the Arab-Israeli conflict, for example, suddenly started being taught as a result of the Schools History Project, or the history of Northern Ireland. Use of the historical source record and historical process, children being introduced to sources and artifacts like the glorious collection that Megan has just shared with us. A focus on the historic environment, history around us, the project called it, so that every child would see history around them and be able to understand it and analyze it in the landscape, in the buildings, and so on. The project also developed the idea of analyzing continuity and change. Much broader themes over time. This was a move away from the traditional patch approach to history of just studying a period. So instead, we'll look at energy across centuries, or we'll look at medicine or crime and punishment across centuries. And also a focus on depth studies. Again, this links to using sources. So these are all familiar things now that you tend to regard as almost without question as good practice within history. And finally, knitting all that together, the use of some disciplinary concepts. And this goes back to the point about wanting to come up with a way of teaching history that was rational, as the project authors put it. So let's think about the sorts of questions that history asks. Causes, causation, change, continuity, similarity and difference, significance, and so forth. So you started to see these terms, or second-order concepts, as we came to call them, sort of reified and structured as a way of teaching the subject. So Schools Council History Project rapidly took off, rapidly became establishment orthodoxy. It took over all of our GCSE exams in 1988 when we had a big reform of our exam system. And eventually, when we had our first national curriculum in 1991, its principles were enshrined. So a radical project became establishment orthodoxy quite quickly. What went wrong? Okay, I'm going to suggest 5 things that went wrong. But more constructively, I'm also going to suggest how quite quickly, and this is the bit of the story that's often not told, history teachers themselves began to solve these problems. Because in the UK, we have a pretty strong tradition, as I think you do amongst yourselves, of history teachers writing about their practice, of history teachers researching. Quite a lot of history teachers train as researchers by doing MEds, but still stay in school. And we have a very vibrant journal, which Paul mentioned earlier, called Teaching History. So I'm going to go through 5 things that went wrong, but also talk about the sorts of things history teachers did quite quickly to begin to put them right. But you'll see, as I'm saying this, that these problems remain a threat. And they particularly remain a threat where teachers are unaware of earlier solutions that have been produced. So this is my sense of the first thing that often goes wrong. Trying to teach children about historical evidence, but reducing it to a horrible thing called source work. I know we've just allowed the word source work to enter our vocabulary, and we all know what we mean by that, and we don't intend it to be horrible, and I'm sure that the noble people in this room don't let it become horrible, but I think you all know what I mean. Turning it into a set of arid, dry exercises. Turning it into something quite algorithmic and formulaic. Can I spot an unreliable source at 100 meters? Almost became, the thing you were supposed to do. An obsession with bias. And a kind of all sorts of problems it started to create in children. This was noticed very early, lots of commentaries on this in the 1980s by teachers and inspectors, of children assuming that what you had to do with sources was hunt out the naughty ones. So it's those biased sources, and that word bias, no, it's biased, chuck it in the bin. And this has gone on to sort of plague, even though we fight against it, this assumption that bias is a bad thing. Now, it's easy to see why this comes about, because if you're trying to teach children skills, if you call it a skill, and you try to get them to detect certain things, then they start to look for the rule, and they want to apply the rule, and before you know it, you're fighting against it, and you've pushed it through to its illogical conclusion. But worst of all, what goes wrong at its worst, and I'm sure you've all seen this happen and recognize the danger, what goes wrong is that the very thing this revolution was trying to stop, which is children thinking that history is boring and dull and pointless, actually is continued. And the glories of handling artifacts, of the awe that comes from looking at the kinds of things we were looking at earlier, and the joy that comes from realizing that actually we can ask and answer questions using the traces of the past, and the humility that brings in us, and the criticality that can, for all the glories really of using sources in schools, actually is lost in this awful thing called death by sources A to F. And of course, historians don't look at sources as, little boxes called source A and source F. This was becoming an enormous problem in the 1980s in England and was much commented on. So there's kind of no excuse for it to still be a problem. And yet we see it recur. So evidential thinking reduced to dry skills, exercises, notions of bias and reliability dominating things. And I suppose what worries me, and I see this in jurisdictions around the world, so I do a lot of work internationally with history teachers, is where people are adopting these methods, they start reducing it to these sort of exercises that are not joined up. Or worst of all, as a sort of preparation for the exam. This is how you're going to be examined, so we'll practice these darn question formulae, and sometimes we'll practice them for 5 years. We've completely lost all our moorings about what the point of the thing is. And it doesn't actually make the children much better at it either. The second problem that occurred in practice was, the best way I can sum it up crisply, is a lack of synthesis. Now, this was noticed brilliantly by the original leader of the project, the president of the project, when he returned to the school's history project conference in 1997. At its 25th anniversary. And he was given the speech, the keynote address at that conference. His name was David Sylvester. So he'd been one of the architects of the original project, invited back 25 years later to this great gathering of about 350 history teachers who were celebrating 25 years of the project. And David Sylvester was invited to give a critical appraisal of the last 25 years of the project. And of course he celebrated it, and of course he congratulated teachers for taking it forwards, and of course he rejoiced in the way in which we had managed to revive history education and make it strong and the influence it was having elsewhere in the world. But then he decided to do a critique. And he said some really interesting things. He talked about source work going down the pan, but he also talked about a lack of synthesis. He said, why have we allowed history to become endless atomizing analysis? When do children get an opportunity to put it back together again, to create substantial things? Whether that's writing an essay, building an argument, a rich extended argument. When do we do that? And he said, of course, that still exists, but the trouble is we have drifted into, and this was the expression he used, we have drifted into the kind of history teaching, which is, here's a proposition, now give me a reaction. Here's source A, do something with it. It's become transactional. It's become overly analytic, and it's not synthetic. When are children actually building arguments and bringing stuff together again? So he was highly critical of that. The third thing that I think has been a serious problem and keeps rearing its head, I'm long enough in the tooth to have seen it rear its head about 4 times, I think now, and I just hope it doesn't keep coming back. If we get initial teacher training, pre-service training right, it shouldn't, but it does keep coming back. People keep reinventing this square wheel. And the square wheel I've summed up there with number 3, and that is trying to create progression models that are totally skill-based within each of those second-order concepts. Yeah, so within causation or change in continuity, imagining there are kind of levels of performance. Now, the origin of this is easy to understand because a lot of cognitive psychology was done around children's ideas about history and how these change. And a lot of that fed into the project in the 70s and 80s. It's a research tradition that carried on into the 90s. And it's very valuable to look at how children's ideas about history change over time. And it does tell us something interesting and important. And so important work by people like Peter Lee and Dennis Schmilt have helped us to think about children's ideas changing over time. But they never intended it to become a progression model that could be used as a mark scheme. They never intended this kind of thing to appear. Now, does that look familiar? Not that particular one, but that kind of thing, yeah? And what I've done there is done a very simplified version of our first national curriculum for history in 1991, which was divided up into 3 attainment targets, one of which was divided up into 3 strands, and those 3 strands were change, causation, similarity, and difference. The whole thing made 45 separate boxes, and actually there were 10 levels, not 6, so I've just summarized that so it's easier for you to take in, but you get the idea. Now, it has its roots in something really very sensible, in that, if you look at what children do, age sort of 6 to 16, they might broadly move in that direction. But once you start saying, this is a goal a child should reach by age 10 or 14 or 16, and once you start doing something really daft and turn something like that into a mark scheme, look at the behaviors you will inevitably foster in teachers, the inevitable hoop jumping. And also, it's just wrong, isn't it? Because we know that finding a single cause can be done by a 7-year-old or it can be done at postdoctoral thesis level. Actually, there isn't really a hierarchy of difficulty in that. The lower ones are logically prior to the later ones in the same sense that it's logically prior to put water in your kettle before you turn it on. Okay, so they're logically prior, but they're not necessarily more difficult than each other. Now, of course, you can make that sort of thing work, but all you end up doing is sort of teaching children these particular formulae. So that's what I mean about a progression model within a particular concept. And we see this, and I see it being picked up all over the world as a sort of the great holy grail. This will be the thing that will solve the problem of how we'll assess skills. And it doesn't. It just leads to quite damaging behaviors. So we need to be more sophisticated around what it means to assess children's ability to think within a concept. Because causation, to take that example, does matter. It really does matter that we teach children to recognize different kinds of causation question, so that they understand something like why was there a Russian Revolution in 1917 is a causation question, but it's a different kind of causation question from something like how important was international pressure in ending apartheid in South Africa? One pushes relative importance of causes, the other's more open. Each commands a different kind of causal argument. That needs to be taught. That is fascinating, that is useful, but it doesn't collapse into these hierarchies. Even if you do have to come up with something that sort of approximates with a hierarchy for exam purposes, the last thing you want to do is turn that into a progression model. So we're working on this level and then that level. And this kind of thing, as it's reared its head in England, has become an enormous problem because sometimes head teachers, principals of schools who are not historians and don't understand this actually expect teachers to be teaching with reference to a mark scheme, because they're imagining they're discerning progress. So pressure on accountability has compounded the problem. I've seen this come around so many times. So, fourth problem, sorry, this is the depressing bit, we'll get to the optimistic bit in a moment. The fourth problem, but I hope, are you recognizing some of these problems in your various versions? Okay. Excessive isolated depth studies. Perhaps I've been a bit harsh there. One of the glories of the school's history project was that it started to show how to do really detailed studies, where you just drill down and understand something in depth using its fascinating source material, instead of just these sort of sweeping high politics and international relations, which tended to be the stuff of history teaching before. The kind of thing where sort of abstract noun is chasing abstract noun, and we never see any actual people or drama or story or colour. So depth studies is great, and we need depth studies in the way we teach history. We need micro-history as well as other kinds of history. However, if your total curriculum, particularly when you get to the senior levels, is a set of, I like to think of them as isolated boreholes, so we'll do something on women's suffrage, and we'll do something on Nazi Germany, and we'll do something on the Aztecs, and we'll do something on and we'll do one sort of thematic study, perhaps. And we'll do a local study, or we'll do an independent study project. That's your course. That is not an adequate secondary course, let alone an exam course. So we've seen this wash up in the context of many examination syllabuses, but also we started to see it in the 1980s with the typical secondary school curricula. And in England, it's years 7, 8, and 9 are our lower years. In years 10 and 11 are our exam years, and years 7, 8, and 9, children were increasingly doing these isolated depth studies and unable to get things to join up. And actually not getting the value out of the depth studies, because they didn't have a sort of big picture into which they were fitting it. My favourite story about this is a school that spent a whole term on the assassination of JFK. And in looking at the assassination of Kennedy, what was absolutely fascinating was that they spent several weeks building a full-scale model of the assassination, complete with cardboard grassy knoll and papier-mâché car. And these children loved it. It was great. We spent an entire term doing the assassination of Kennedy. And at the end of the term, one lad, when he was asked what he'd been doing, he said to his teacher, "Who is this Kennedy bloke anyway?" Which kind of sums it up. I didn't get any sense of why it was important in the bigger picture. So, I don't want to knock the odd bit of papier-mâché and the odd bit of depth, but a caricature, I wish, but actually is quite real. So, and finally this, another problem that started to emerge that was noticed by a number of commentators is that it's all very well looking at sources, but actually you need to look equally at what historians do with sources. And you could say that's covered by saying, oh, well, we have primary and secondary sources. And of course, we teach children the skill of telling the difference between a primary and a secondary source. But of course, we know this is nonsense, because primary and secondary sources are not absolute terms. Something becomes secondary depending on the thing you're writing. Something can be primary or it can be secondary for different purposes of inquiry. So something that is a film, can be primary, it can be secondary in that it's a film about something in the past. But then if you're looking at the period in which the film was produced, it's actually primary for that period. So that was one major problem that people got wrong. But more importantly, if historians' writings and other secondary records, whether that's museum or theme park or feature film, but other more popular interpretations, subsequent interpretations of the past, are reduced to gobbets, are reduced to tiny slices, then children are not really getting a chance to understand the process of construction, of how people construct stories about the past. That's difficult, and they need time to get into that and study it. And so often, what a lot of commentators noticed in the 80s, mostly teachers themselves, and some inspectors, was that we're spending a lot of time getting children to reach their views on the past, but not enough time actually getting them gradually to understand and to enjoy reading what historians write about the past, or to weigh up and critically evaluate the range of other more popular expressions about the past. So, how did communities of history teachers address these various things? So I just want to whiz through those 5 depressing things now and talk about solutions. But my message here really is that history teachers, as you know, and as I know, are very, very capable. And just as, I'm going to be sharing some examples of how by the early 90s, history teachers were solving these problems. The bigger question is, why, if they can be solved, do they still recur as problems? And that says something interesting about, I don't know, power relations, perhaps within the wider education world. But it also, I think, tells us something, and I'm going to finish up at the end with some suggestions around this, about what we need to do to break this cycle of these things going wrong. So the first thing, how did communities of history teachers address these things? Let's go back to evidential thinking being reduced to dry, arid exercises. What you start to see in the 1990s, but particularly in the 2000s, and I did an analysis of, I think I came up with 302 articles by history teachers who gradually, collectively were solving this problem, is the following solutions. History teachers being much more constructive with sources. Not why can't I use this source, not why is it unreliable, not why is it biased, but how is the bias useful? For what is it reliable? So being constructive in 2 senses, putting things together, going back to my point about synthesis that David Sylvester made, putting things together, but also being constructive in the sense of, here is the source that contains, if it is a record rather than a relic, that contains all sorts of positioning. And how then do I use that positioning so that I am realizing how that source could actually be used to answer a particular question? So clarity around whether a source is a relic or a record. An understanding that a relic has no conscious commentary, but can indirectly reveal certain things about the past, whereas a record has some kind of conscious commentary. And within that, it'll be full of attitudinal positioning, call it bias if you will, that is actually valuable. And training children to be constructive so that their disposition is to say, how could I use this source? Secondly, avoiding this question that recurs again and again. I think I've seen it in some of your exams. How would you use, or how would a historian use this source for this particular topic? Well, that's no good. It has to be, how would you use the source for a particular inquiry? Because a source cannot become evidence until it has been interrogated. A source is just a source. Evidence isn't just there. Evidence has to be constituted. And evidence is constituted through a process of interrogation. And that's why children need several years of careful training in that. And what we need children is to, hopefully, by the time they're in year 10, 11, 12, to understand that you come up with questions and they yield sub-questions and you interrogate that source for a particular inquiry. And there are various ways of teaching that so that children find it fascinating, but also so that they're not left just doing this sort of daft exercise, this very kind of nugatory little task of some imaginary reference to some imaginary inquiry that's not even been stated, and they're being asked simply to say, how is this source reliable and useful for learning about the suffragettes? It's hopelessly unfocused. Thirdly, attending to contextual knowledge. Now, this became something that was talked about hugely in the 1990s, that one unfortunate casualty of the SHP revolution had been that teachers sometimes, I mean, not perhaps as much as people imagine, but had sometimes in effect denigrated content. And actually, you really can't understand a source properly unless you understand its context. And that therefore we shouldn't be taking sources out of context. We need to be thinking very carefully about the children's knowledge, not only of the wider context of the source, but also of the provenance of that particular source. And that children really need to be thinking about the role of the source in the context of a very broad and thorough picture of knowledge. Because if you think about it, historians would never, comment on a source without knowing a heck of a lot about the context. So, attending to contextual knowledge, it's going to be a theme that I'm going to explore in much more depth tomorrow morning. It's something that's talked about a lot by history teachers. And pulling those first 3 bullet points together is my 4th bullet point, joining up source activities into a coherent journey. This was the birth of something known as teaching history through inquiry, which is not the same as inquiry-based learning. Okay, which sometimes a sort of technical curricular thing, and it's maybe an England thing, but it's actually really helpful to be clear about curricular purposes. When Michael Riley wrote his famous article, the deliciously titled Into the Key Stage 3 History Garden, Choosing and Planting Your Inquiry Questions, an article that all new history teachers are reared on in England, he was not talking about discovery learning or children finding things out for themselves. He was simply talking about a curricular expression. Children working across a sequence of lessons around one question. One inquiry question governing 4, 5, 6 lessons. And at the end of those lessons, the children answering that question because they've spent several lessons working on that question, being trained to interrogate it. Sources joined up, not sort of gratuitously plonked. And a really interesting question that captures one of the second-order concepts, causation and so on, or maybe evidence itself. And the teacher, you could use any pedagogy. It could be direct instruction through to something much more open. That's not the point. The point is, as each lesson unfolds, the teacher is constantly referring to that question. That's what Riley meant by an inquiry in this technical sense. So the beginning of lesson 2 will be, where did we get to? Well, we got this far in our hypothesis in response to that question, but let me now introduce another layer of knowledge or a new source, and oh my goodness, that's going to complicate things, isn't it? And the children constantly building their answer to that inquiry question, testing it, going back to the drawing board, testing it again, until in the final lesson of the inquiry, they really can put together a tentative, extended response of their own, a little argument or whatever, whether that's an essay or a documentary or a debate or whatever. So not this sort of very brief engagement with a question over just 2 lessons or 1 lesson, but a question that lives and makes the movement from one lesson to the next breathe. Again, there are hundreds of articles by history teachers on how to do that. And it's become an approach that has enlivened source work at its best. Many debates about how to do it and so on, but the point is, it's contextualized, it's joined up. The teacher spends a lot of time looking at the properties of that question, and the children have no sense of sources, being source A, source B, doing exercises on them. They're trying to answer a question. I'll give an example, I think, because I think I have got time, from a textbook that I wrote in 2007. Which was called Islamic Meetings of Minds, Islamic Encounters. And this illustrates Riley's principle. And Michael Riley himself was working with me on this textbook. So look at that inquiry question. How can we know what Muslims thought of crusaders and invaders? And you can see what's going on here. It's an attempt to try to get a different perspective on the Crusades, which we're always trying to do in England. But the inquiry question is very, very carefully worded. Riley was adamant that a good inquiry question is always open. Okay, it is a genuine question. It is not a, so it's no good, saying something, asking a question like, what were the Crusades or something, or, an inquiry question is not a question to which the answer is already given. An inquiry question is a genuinely open question. When I was a teacher trainer at Cambridge, I think I spent hundreds and hundreds of hours constantly with my new teachers and with their mentors who were training them in school, just looking at the art of wording an inquiry question. That's how long it takes. And I think you need to go on working on it when you're mentored as a new teacher in your second, third year. It's difficult. And you need to learn how to go to historical scholarship, what historians are writing, to check your inquiry questions are sensible and authentic. So it's not, a title for a chunk of work. It's a profound and difficult art. And that's, I know from experience, a really good question because it's nicely focused on the evidential issues at hand. And here, and I'm indebted to Michael Riley for this himself, because as I say, he worked on this book with me. And it's a lovely little inquiry designed for low-attaining pupils in our year 7, which is 11, 12-year-olds. Again, being very carefully trained at the beginning of their secondary journey, nicely built around a daft idea of a hopeless historian who keeps getting the sources wrong. And this is the kind of training that I've noticed really starts to make a difference to children actually understanding what source work's about. So our rather hopeless historian wants to throw away al-Masoudi's source because he can see that it's biased. Luckily, someone's there to help him. Give 3 examples from the source to show that al-Masoudi is biased against the Franks. Okay, get that out of the way. Give some reasons why al-Masoudi's description might be biased against the Franks, why it might be biased. Copy the second historian's final words of advice and add some examples to show how the bias can help. Blah, blah, blah. Okay, so, and then moving on, so what we're going to do in lesson 2, there's this rather gorgeous source. How can you slumber in the shade and comfort and safety where life is as soft as orchard flowers? How can your eyes sleep while your Muslim brothers in Syria have no dwelling place other than the saddles of camels and the bellies of vultures? Sources are beautiful, aren't they? They need to be gloried in and rejoiced and spent time on them. Must the foreigners feed on our shame? Beautiful young girls have been shamed and now hide their sweet faces in their hands. White swords' points are red with blood, and the iron of brown lances is stained with gore. This is war, and the infidel's sword is naked in his hand, ready to be sheathed in men's necks and skulls. For fear of death, the Muslims are evading the fire of battle. So here's a source that you need to spend time on for a whole host of reasons. And what are we going to do with it in this journey in lesson 2? Oh dear, our hopeless historian thinks the Iraqi poet's account of al-Hawari's speech is too poetic to tell us anything useful. Write a simplified version of al-Hawari's words that capture the main points in a clear and direct way. So just spending time comprehending it before we even move on to the evaluative work. Another feature of really strong inquiry that contextualize sources is using collections of sources that have a meaningful relationship. And here's a nice collection, not just an isolated source, but a whole series of them. I won't go into reading these out in detail, but you can glance at them. I particularly like the one in the middle. A Frankish knight who had become my close friend said to me, "My brother, I am leaving for my homeland, and I want you to send me your 14-year-old son. He will come to our country where he can learn wisdom and chivalry. When he returns, he will be a wise man." These words would never come out of the head of a sensible man. For even if my son were to be taken captive in war, it could not bring him a worse misfortune than carrying him into the land of the Franks. So glory in the sources, being fascinated by them, putting them together as a collection and so on over time. Hopeless historian this time, he doesn't know what we mean by the word implies. Help him by copying this chart and adding more example from the extracts, blah, blah, blah. And then at the end of the inquiry, this is simplified for a textbook, drawing it all together and allowing the children to attempt a constructive response of their own. Now, this probably isn't new to noble history teachers in this room, but I know that it will, as with English teachers of history in England, it will be quite different from the kinds of approaches that we end up having to use when we're preparing children for exams. And notice the key features of it. Really strong emphasis in knowledge. Very, I've only shown you, isolated examples, but very thorough knowledge of these crusades. Really careful analysis of the individual sources, taking time, and the children brought back again and again and again to that inquiry question. How can we know? So they produce a sophisticated example at the end. So the second problem I mentioned earlier was the lack of synthesis. Remember David Sylvester's remark of endless atomizing analysis. Again, I'm not going to go into such detail in each of these things, but I will be doing some more tomorrow morning. What started to happen in the 1990s, and I was still teaching at this time, so I was very much part of it, was a push for lower attainers in particular to do much, much more extended writing. And I became quite passionate about this because I thought, that the children who cannot write, as in several paragraphs, will be the underclass of tomorrow. And we have to get them to write at length and in their own way, and not in response to exam questions. And this generated sometimes called a movement of history teachers in England writing about the multiple ways in which you can get children to produce extended writing, not by importing literacy techniques, but by doing good history. And that was a very, very important distinction, because the teachers who were advocating teaching children to write were teaching them to produce causal arguments, were teaching them to do evidential analysis. And so the very business of arranging material in the essay was one and the same thing as historical analysis. And it became a very sophisticated and successful set of processes. I was trying to think of a really good article that summarizes that movement, an academic article, and I think my best bet is probably Jim Carroll's 2019 article. I'll let Paul have these slides so you can have copies of that. So, extended writing then. Enormously important in enabling history teachers to tackle that root problem of children having this isolated gobbety experience, reading gobbets and responding in gobbets, rather than pulling things together. Third problem I mentioned earlier were those wretched conceptual progression models turned into mark schemes. And one of the solutions here, or the major solution I would say, which has evolved gradually over time, and which you won't see written about in total anywhere, but there are numerous examples of it, is instead of saying, how do children get better at causal reasoning? Do they move from monocausal explanations to multi-causal explanations, to prioritizing causes, to doing a dance with bananas with causes? Instead of moving through that kind of model, instead to simply say, let's make sure that over time, across their secondary schooling, they are repeatedly bumping into causation questions. And our sign of progress is when they recognize a causation question. They say, that's asking for causes, causal analysis, not change. And when they increasingly understand the shape and structure of the account which such a question commands. So children know that this is how you arrange causes to build an argument. This is not something that you can sort of put into some kind of crude hierarchy, but it rather requires judgment around the end of secondary schooling as to whether children have grasped this. It's fiendishly hard, but not impossible, for examiners to test that adequately, but it is perfectly possible, provided you go for more open-ended mark schemes and you're not looking for kind of rigid itemizing of points that get you to the highest marks. So carefully looking at types of inquiry question. So what you'll find a lot of history teachers who've been thoughtful about this problem in England doing, though sometimes they have to defy their senior leaders who want them to be doing something much more focused on an exam mark scheme, what you'll find them doing is carefully looking at their causation questions, their change in continuity questions across 5 years of secondary schooling, and really thinking about how those questions are recurring, but also thinking about how good the children's grasp is of the type and structure of argument that each commands. Fourth problem I mentioned earlier, the diet of isolated depth studies. Now, one of the biggest problems here, which is a problem the world over, is that we have finite time. And I think you have particularly finite time here because of your tradition of social studies too, in terms of the amount of time that children have actually doing discrete history. But everywhere it's an issue. You know, well, it's all very well saying, you know, we want them also to do more overview history, and we want to join everything up, and we want to make sure that we do some Central Asian history and all the history we've missed out. It's all very well doing that, but there's no time. But there are solutions to this, and the chief solution is to be intelligent, not about the incidence of overview and depth, but about the interplay of overview and depth. And it's beautifully summed up by a history teacher from Suffolk in England called Dale Banham, who's written a lot about this. In his expression, there is overview lurking in the depth. And that's in his famous article, The Return of King John, again, which is an article that's read by, you know, pre-service history teachers everywhere. And what he meant by that was, you can't just sort of look at an aggregate of, oh yeah, I should do this much depth and this much overview, and then you can squish it all in. Something magic happens when children acquire knowledge. It somehow makes them readier for new knowledge. That's pretty obvious, but it's a principle often not applied. You know, just think of, I'm thinking of a good example of this. I'm currently reading Peter Frankopan's The Silk Roads, I'm sure a book that's familiar to many of you, A New History of the World, The Silk Roads, A New History of the World. And it's an absolutely wonderful story, which is giving me all sorts of new knowledge about trade routes and about cultural change, about migration, about everything. It's changing my view of the world. And there are some chapters which I can read incredibly fast. And that's simply because it refers to things that I know about in depth. It's not rocket science. And there are other chapters that are tough to read because the volume of material that is new is quite overwhelming, and I have to slow down and think a bit. And that really is just an analogue for the experience a child goes through. And often we don't attend to the fact that sometimes when you spend a lot of time in a depth study, it actually prepares you then to cope with a subsequent overview. And what Banham said was this. He spent 8 weeks doing a depth study of a single king in England, King John, a medieval king. And everyone said, how can you spend 8 weeks on one king? You know, shock, horror. What about all the other kings? But I was so fascinated by what I heard this guy saying, I went and watched him teach. And I went and watched him teach year 7, so that's 11 and 12-year-olds. And honestly, you could have pulled down a screen and therefore not allowed me to see how old the children were, and I would have thought I was listening to 15, 16, 17-year-olds debating. And that's because their knowledge of John was so thorough that they understood social relationships. They understood baronial power. They had a vocabulary because they were steeped in the stories. And what he found then was that when he then did an overview of the remaining medieval kings, so he did an overview of 200 years with just a sort of briefer, quicker march through, they were so much readier for it because it meant something to them. So in other words, depth, he argued, precedes overview. Now, many people argue the other way around. You've got to do overview, then you do the depth. There can be some merit in that, but of course there are pros and cons. So there's a whole sort of industry of writing around this issue of the interplay of overview and depth by history teachers, which starts to solve some of these profound problems of excessive depth and starts to deal with the problem of finite time. So, finally, my time's almost up. That fifth problem I mentioned, the lack of emphasis on reading the products of historians, historical scholarship. Interesting how this solution came about. It was assisted for once by a curriculum change in our national curriculum, which is unusual. I mentioned earlier that when we had our first national curriculum in 1991, National Curriculum for History, it actually made SHP establishment orthodoxy. But it also did something new. It introduced a new category called interpretations of history. And at the time, as a head of history, I thought, you know, why do we need that? Because, you know, that's already there anyway, isn't it? You know, children are already interpreting the past, and we have source work. But actually, in retrospect, it was so useful that it was introduced, because it was about taking secondary sources and taking them seriously. And not just the scholarship of historians, but actually getting children to spend a lot of time thinking about how all subsequent accounts of the past are constructed, whether popular, scholarly, propagandist, political, or whatever. And here's something, for example, taking apart the work of Anthony Cam, the historian, writing about the Emperor Nero in 1995. And it's designed to get children to notice which sources Anthony Cam might have been using. So they're given some Suetonius and some other sources, and they think about the relationship between the sources and the scholarly work. But then the children move on to look at other accounts of Nero, such as this lovely account by the mayor of Anzio, which was the place where Nero was born. And look at what the mayor of Anzio wants to say about Nero. A plaque declares that Nero Claudius Caesar Augustus Germanicus was born at Anzio in AD 37, an acclaimed emperor, and presided over a period of peace, great splendor, and important reforms. It does not mention that he had his mother, Agrippina, put to death and divorced and later executed his wife, Octavia, so that he could marry Poppaea Sabina. Nor does it record that Nero put the blame for the six-day Great Fire of AD 64, which he may have started, on the Christians, sparking a campaign of persecution. At a distance of 20 centuries, serious historians are re-evaluating the figure of Nero, said Mr. Bruscini, the mayor. He was a great emperor, loved by his people for his courageous social reforms and for the long period of peace which characterized his reign. This statue is a contribution to remembering Nero, blah, blah, blah. So what interpretations is about is this social practice of human beings. All through history, human beings have chosen to tell stories about the past. It's what we do. We tell stories about the past for good or ill. And we need to understand why people do this. Why is it that whether it's a mayor wanting to resurrect the view of an ancient emperor or something that perhaps is more obviously pernicious in its effects, why do they do that? And what are these cycles that cause accounts to change over time? This is really quite different from source work. And what's more, it has developed, I counted 243 articles on this topic, by the way, the other day. It's developed, again, a whole industry of practice among history teachers. And it results in those sorts of inquiry questions. Look how different they are from inquiry questions about causation or change. They are all about subsequent constructions. And they avoid the classic, was Nero a hero or a villain? Okay, which is actually really problematical as a question and is not going to get you at the subsequent accounts. And instead, they ask you to think about what is it saying, how and why is it constructed? Wholly different emphasis to understand the social practice of interpreting it. And above all, brings me back to my theme of knowledge. If you're studying interpretations, you have to study two periods at once, because you have to study the thing being interpreted and the period of the interpreter. So it's no good studying an interpretation of Nero, so it's no good studying, say, for example, Shakespeare play about Julius Caesar if you're not also studying the 16th century. So it actually makes the emphasis on knowledge all the more important to answer questions like that. So that's why I'm going to drill down into a couple of these tomorrow morning. And I just can finish with a final comment on what do these solutions have in common. All of them have in common a big emphasis on breadth of knowledge and on thoroughness of knowledge, making sure the children have actually mastered it. And only thus can they enter the conversation of the classroom. I've written about that in the article I've mentioned there. Secondly, what they have in common is what I call curricular theorizing, thinking about the patterning and sequencing of content across a sequence of lessons. And thirdly, what they have in common is the fact that they are fruits of teacher-led subject communities, creating a coherent collective discourse. That's the point where I want to stop, because if we don't nurture, it's exactly what's going on here in this conference, if we don't nurture our subject communities, that we don't introduce new teachers to the locus authority to which they, as professionals, should refer. And if they imagine that the locus of authority as professionals that they should refer is the exam board, then we're nowhere. Actually, we as subject communities, nationally and internationally, should be holding the exam boards and indeed governments to account. And if we don't get that sense of professional identity and status, and we don't give it some kind of scholarly strength, then we are vulnerable to all sorts of threats. So through our journals, through our conferences, these things really, really matter, and we have to induct new teachers into them. because the threats are huge. Threat number one, treating examination specifications and mark schemes as progression models. So despite all of those things, we still have that problem in England, and we're now facing another recurring bout of danger around it, of expecting some senior leaders expecting teachers to practice exam marks. Secondly, the threat of genericism, or 21st century skills in its latest guise. This really worries me, not because I don't think it's vitally important that children develop information skills and communication ability and teamwork and all of that, but because very often that kind of criticality is actually redundant, because it's already there in the subject disciplines themselves. And there's nothing more frustrating for a history teacher who's systematically trained pupils how to understand the conditions under which valid claims about the past can be made, than to have some sort of superficial, generic form of skills bolted onto them. So I think we need to be very, very careful about what we're hearing about generic skills, which aren't actually sensitive to the subject. And the third danger is political interference. Unless we have ourselves as a locus of authority, we're in trouble. I was looking up examples of this. It's everywhere. You just go on the internet every second and you can see it. So I thought I'd conclude with something really very depressing. Here was an article in the New York Times. I don't know if any of you saw it recently. It was published on the 7th of April, I think. And I saw this. So it's a group of politicians in Michigan. The changes were made after a group of prominent conservatives helped revise the standards. They drew attention to a long simmering debate over whether republic is a better term than democracy to describe the American form of government. Now, it's completely terrifying. But on an optimistic note, to link it to my point about subject communities, I am encouraged that in England at least, that wouldn't happen. History teachers simply wouldn't stand for that kind of level of interference. We've never had that kind of prescription. We have politicians saying all sorts of stuff about what they want the history curriculum to be like. But actually, the history curriculum never changes much, and nobody takes a lot of notice. But that level of prescription, people sitting down to minute detail and trying to take the word democracy out, when what history teachers should be doing is leaving it open for children to discuss the different meanings of a word and exploring how they've changed over time and how they've been reported on. That's the substance of a history curriculum. And the only people who can be guardians of that are the subject community. Thank you very much.